I am New York.
Yes, I'm New York.
I am New York.
Yo soy Nueva York.
Sono New York.
Je suis New York.
We are New York.
Welcome to DiverseCITY, where we explore New York's eclectic enclaves, one neighborhood at a time. I'm Zyphus Lebrun. This month, we're going to take a special look back at 2020. Saying that it's been a trying year, I know, it's an understatement. For the last few months, the headlines have been dominated with the news of the unprecedented pandemic and the presidential election that many called the most important in this country's history. While those stories played out on the national stage, they were impacting things happening around the corner. That's where we'll begin, as the number of COVID-19 cases start to spike around the country and hospitals warn of fewer beds. It's a stark reminder of how bleak things were back at the beginning, when the clarion call went out to all able-bodied health workers to head to the front lines of this fight. Sadly, right now, it feels like we're right back where we started. We'll revisit one of those doctors later, but first, Elmhurst Hospital became a symbol of how COVID-19 wreaked havoc on New York's medical system. The hospital served some of the zip codes with the highest number of COVID cases. It's also the only hospital serving more than 1.5 million people in a vast stretch of north-central western Queens. Robert Pozaricki, editor-in-chief of AM New York and former editor of the Queens Courier, spoke to us about how the hospital became so beleaguered.
I think a lot of factors that have come into place are kind of converging at this crisis. If you had to draw a north to south border in Queens, right, and you started from LaGuardia, and you follow the Grand Central Parkway down, and then the Van Wyck Expressway down, you're talking about 3-4 hospitals, if you include Jamaica, for half of the entire borough of Queens. When the 3 hospitals I mentioned in the story closed about 11 years ago, that kind of compounded everything, because when you had Elmhurst Hospital work and you had St. John's nearby and that was open, and you had Parkway and Forest Hills when that was operating, they were alleviating pressure off each other. Both St. John's and Parkway were massively in debt. St. John's almost went into bankruptcy along with Mary Immaculate and other hospitals within the St. Vincent's Catholic Medical Centers chain in 2006. This is a time before Obamacare. So you had a lot of uninsured patients seeking treatment and not having the ability to pay for it. The hospital never turned the clients away. You had health insurance providers, which is still a problem today, being slow in terms of reimbursing hospitals for the care they provided. Medicare, Medicaid, those payments are slow to come into to the hospitals. And it left the hospitals saddled with massive debt. Parkway, as I recall, was in a similar situation. And Parkway was the first to go. A few months later, St. John's and Mary Immaculate followed. So after St. John's and Mary Immaculate closed in 2009, Parkway had closed in 2008. Elmhurst was really the only major medical center for the Elmhurst area: Corona, Jackson Heights, Woodside, Maspeth, Middle Village. And they saw an immediate increase in the emergency room visits. Now, they had been managing that. I think the passage of the Affordable Care Act helped in terms of providing more health insurance, improving compensation for hospitals. The advent of the urgent care center, those being opened up, that also kind of took strain off of the hospitals in general. But they were still pretty overwhelmed, as far as I understand, at Elmhurst. And they were planning a major emergency department expansion in the past few months. It was supposed to get underway this spring, and then the coronavirus pandemic hit. Can you look back on it now, that just a few months after St. John's and Mary Immaculate and Parkway had closed, all of a sudden Queens gets hit with a swine flu epidemic. It was not as virulent as coronavirus, but as the Times Ledger reported, it was one of our sister papers, Elmhurst immediately got overcrowded with patients. So that was kind of like the harbinger, the sign that, the loss of the hospitals was finally being felt, and that if nothing was done soon to kind of remedy this, that it would get worse in case, there would be another pandemic. And now here we are. I think the only way out of this down the line, and maybe this is something that can be talked about, and when the dust finally settles on coronavirus, the borough really needs additional hospital space. It needs more than urgent care centers. It needs places where people can go in a situation like this, or just any other situation, and get local health care. They don't have to be massive hospitals, but there's certainly a need for them.
We also reported on a doctor's wife who started a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for the highly coveted N95 mask for her husband and other medical professionals. She asked that we not use her full name or identify her husband at a time when hospitals were threatening to fire employees who spoke to the media.
He steps onto this and he's not allowed to step into anything else. He takes off his mask and puts it over there.
That's part of a very elaborate entry process that Janice and her husband have adopted when he arrives home from work. They rightly named the area the COVID corner, but they're taking the threat he faces every day when he goes to work at a major New York hospital very seriously.
Right now, they do temperature checks as you enter. So you line up in the hospital and they temperature check you. If you have a low fever or any kind of fever, they get you tested and you're not allowed to come to the hospital. He saw his coworker like in the same line and she had a low fever. And we found out a couple of days ago that she was also tested positive as well.
Her concerns are heightened because her immune system is not at 100% because of a recent surgical procedure.
Every time I have like an itchy throat, I'm like, wait, do I have it? Like, or is it just like, oh, because I just had to clear my throat kind of thing? It's always lingering in my mind. And like, even when it's just been very stressful overall.
Rather than being overwhelmed by her stress, she's decided to start a GoFundMe campaign to purchase 1,000 N95 masks from a distributor in China. The masks are much coveted because they offer better protection against airborne infection. Right now, her husband reuses his because he can't get them from the hospital.
We have 5 and we're rotating it and they're disposable, but we reuse them because we just don't have the supply. And we're hoping that after a few days that we're praying that it is actually the virus will go away. So he'll go back in his new rotation and start on the first mask again.
In the meantime, she and her husband continue a regimen that includes limited physical contact and not sharing household utensils. Small sacrifices, she says, compared to others.
I feel very blessed because right now we don't have kids yet, but the people who I've been talking to with kids and they're in front line, it's been really tough on them, especially not being able to. I have another friend who is a nurse. She has a 4-year-old kid and she hasn't been able to hug him for the last like 3-4 weeks already now. They've been like video chatting and things like that. Even though they're in the same home, they're not able to see each other. So it's just really heartbreaking a lot of the times.
These next 2 pieces take a break from the pandemic and focus on Superfund sites. The Superfund designation forces the parties responsible for contaminating these areas with hazardous waste to pay for the Environmental Protection Agency-led cleanup. Newtown Creek on the Brooklyn-Queens border is one of those sites and has the dubious distinction of being the 2nd largest oil spill in U.S. history. Crystal Lowe reported on the continued effort to clean up the creek and to create more green space nearby.
The Newtown Creek Nature Walk is one of the few public access points along the waterway. To us, it's a really big issue. There's 11 miles of shoreline on the creek, and there's very, very few places where people can even see it or get to it or interact with it. And that has, we believe, helped perpetuate a state of pollution and dumping because it's basically a fenced-off waterway that no one has a lot of personal connection with.
Willis Elkins moved to Greenpoint in 2007. He got involved with a community-based environmental protection organization, Newtown Creek Alliance, in 2013. He says that it's really important to reconnect the community with the waterway that's in their backyard.
I got really interested in the water, and so I started going out on the water, got a small boat to paddle around and stuff like that, and then met a lot of the people that were involved in Newtown Creek Alliance and other community residents who had been fighting for many years to see this place cleaned up.
a cleanup of approximately 17 to 30 million gallons of raw oil mixed with water underground that was discovered in 1978. That makes it the site of one of the largest oil spills in U.S. history.
I think the impacts of the pollution on the community are frankly hard to quantify, but they're numerous. So you have issues where the waterway has been poisoned. It's become too dangerous to fish in, too dangerous to swim or have primary contact with. And then it's also had untold and unquantified numerous effects on people's health that have lived and worked here.
The Newtown Creek Alliance has teamed up with the nonprofit environmental organization Riverkeeper to identify and eliminate pollution sources in the area. In 2010, Newtown Creek was named a Superfund site by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. The Superfund program is designed to investigate and clean up sites contaminated with hazardous substances.
So there was a number of lawsuits from groups like Riverkeeper, residents of the neighborhood, and then eventually the State Attorney General's office to hold ExxonMobil, who was the primary responsible party for the Greenpoint oil spill, accountable to do a better job cleaning it up and to also give back to the community.
Katie Horowitz is the executive director of the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. The organization was formed in 2003 to raise private funds to expand and improve open space in North Brooklyn. They have also joined the Newtown Creek Alliance in advocating for cleaning up the waterway and creating public access to the creek. Horowitz and the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance have been working closely with the state to complete a transformative project they call Under the K, referring to the land beneath the Kosciuszko Bridge.
The idea was creating a new open space in Greenpoint. Like many neighborhoods across the city, Greenpoint is very dense. There aren't too many spaces that can be, turned into parkland, turned into open space. So working with New York State to transform a sort of unlikely 7 acres underneath a bridge on the banks of the Newtown Creek was an extraordinary opportunity. Since most of us don't have backyards, it's where we play, it's where we read, it's where we sleep, it's where we recreate. And so it's essential to have these spaces that unfortunately a lot of people think are just a luxury, when in fact it's essential benefit to the health and well-being and quality of life of New Yorkers.
Crystal Lowe for DiverseCITY.
The Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn is part of the growing conversation to create more green space in the concrete jungle. The canal is a 1.8-mile waterway that was once touted as a means of helping the surrounding area. Now it's referred to as odorous and ominous. Vanessa Monet told us more about the history and future of this storied passage.
The mere mention of the Gowanus Canal conjures up images of immense pollution, but there are some who are doing their part to change that image.
When we go canoeing, many of us bring with us gloves and a mask, obviously, nowadays, but we always had gloves. And the reason why we had gloves is we would pick up things that we'd find floating in the Gowanus. Everything from plastic bags to bottles and other things that might be floating around the canal.
Owen Foote is the treasurer of the Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club, a volunteer-run environmental awareness organization that's been advocating for waterfront access for 2 decades. The Dredgers are one of the most vocal proponents of the waterfront revival effort. That gained steam after a key aeration component of the canal, the Flushing Tunnel, was reactivated back in 1999.
What it does do is it brings oxygen into the water, which allows for plant life to grow and for life to sort of gather there again. Because there was a time during the 19th century the canal was so toxic that canal boat captains would drive their barges there just to kill all the barnacles on the bottom of their boat.
Joseph Alexiou is the author of Gowanus, Brooklyn's Curious Canal. He says the canal began as a creek that was dredged and has a deep history dating back to 1856.
It was meant to be a drain for all the floodwaters that would come up in the meadows and the fields surrounding the Gowanus Creek, which was this naturally occurring body of water, part of a wetland. that was very inconvenient for the landowners of Brooklyn. And so it was meant to drain the wetlands, and it was also meant to be the exits for the sewers that would be sort of placed around that area around the same time as it was dug. And it was also built to be a shipping lane so that barges could go up and down into the middle, to the heart of Brooklyn and drop off goods and pick up goods.
But the primitive design of Brooklyn's early sewer system is, in part, responsible for the canal's pollution to this day.
The sewer system that they were designing made use of something called combined sewage system or combined sewage overflow. And that's when you have a pipe that captures rainwater and the pipes that catch sewage outflow, so the toilets and sinks and all the things that people throw away ultimately combine into the same pipe. And that combined sewage is supposed to go to a sewage treatment plant. During the 19th century, the sewage treatment plant is known as the ocean. And so effectively, the combined sewage overflow would go into the Bay of New York. However, there were also as many as 16 different outfalls or sewer openings into the canal itself. And that is because in order for combined sewage overflow to work, there has to be emergency exits. And so what that did was that it brought a whole bunch of raw sewage into the canal, which still enters the canal to this day.
Not only is the canal polluted with raw sewage, it's also full of toxic waste that was dumped into and around the waterway by nearby factories. This led the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to declare the Gowanus Canal a Superfund site in 2010.
The city will build 2 tanks, one 8 million gallon and one 4 million gallon tank, to capture as much of the street runoff as possible during the periods of heavy rain and pump that back into the sewage treatment system so that it doesn't enter the canal. And then the second thing that the EPA has planned is completely dredging the floor of the canal so they can remove the 10-foot thick layer of toxic waste known as black mayonnaise.
But not everyone is happy with the fine details of the cleanup plan.
The sad news is they refuse to provide any access. So consequently, if somebody was to fall in when the EPA is said and done, they can't get out. So hopefully they can amend their drawings and designs to at least include access ladders, if not floating docks and stepped surfaces to get to the water's edge so people can touch this nice clean waterway when the EPA is all said and done.
For DiverseCITY, I'm Vanessa Monet.
A lot's been made, and rightfully so, about the essential workers taking care of the sick and dying during the pandemic. The people who often come to mind are healthcare workers and other emergency personnel. However, there are also over 200 street vendors throughout central Queens who are considered essential workers under Governor Andrew Cuomo's COVID-19 pause order. The Deputy Director of the Elmhurst-based Street Vendor Project, Karina Kaufman-Gutierrez, and Juan Carlos, a street vendor, talk to us about some of the challenges these vendors face.
Es una situación que ha descontrolado a toda nuestra familia. Yo soy un vendedor ambulante, usualmente trabajo en una escuela pública vendiendo afuera. Mi papá también es vendedor ambulante, él tiene 70 años, yo tengo 42. Ambos somos de México. Mi papá realmente trabaja porque necesita enviar dinero a mi mamá en México que tiene diabetes. Mi esposa necesita trabajar para proveerle para su mamá que tiene también diabetes y condiciones médicas. Los clientes son básicamente latinos, la mayoría o más del 50% son mexicanos, dominicanos, puertorriqueños y latinos en general. Muchos de ellos han perdido sus trabajos, ambos miembros de la familia. No tienen dinero ni siquiera para la renta, menos para comida, menos para un helado.
This pandemic has hit so hard, not just because of language barriers, but because of the compounded effects of broken immigration system that penalizes people for not having access or a pathway to citizenship. Because of broken labor systems, which create barriers for people who are either cash economy workers or are day laborers from receiving any benefits that would meet their needs, like unemployment insurance, hazard pay for continuing to work. None of that exists for for undocumented communities.
Lo primero que hicieron fue cerrar las escuelas. Sí, y al cerrar las escuelas, eso representa casi el 50% de los ingresos en ventas que tenemos diariamente. Lo siguiente que pasó fue que si nosotros salíamos a vender, policía o sanidad nos podía dar un ticket de hasta $1,000, nos podía quitar la mercancía y podía quitarnos hasta los carritos de helados. Entonces yo vi realmente que la situación se estaba poniendo muy tensa.
There are 780,000 undocumented New Yorkers. Everyone is excluded if they don't have a social security number from receiving benefits through the federal stimulus package, through the CARES Act. And so this creates a situation where some people are getting $1,200, which in itself is not enough. And then others are receiving nothing.
Yo paré de trabajar en la primera semana de marzo. En este caso, a mí como inmigrante no tengo ninguna ayuda de parte de la ciudad. Entonces, la situación es que el gobierno no nos está apoyando con nada. La única ayuda que yo estoy recibiendo es, por ejemplo, de organizaciones comunitarias. Yo estoy yendo a buscar comida 2 días a la semana, una vez al mes. Con eso nosotros hemos podido sobrevivir.
Finally, as the new year approaches, it's nearly impossible to not think of Times Square. It's estimated that about 1 billion people around the world watch the ball drop on their television screens, while thousands more converge in the area. This year, however, despite plans for some live performances, the celebration will be virtual. We spoke to the Times Square Alliance president, Tim Tompkins, earlier this year about how the area was doing and what the Alliance's plans were for the future.
Even though Times Square itself geographically represents like literally 0.1% of the entire city's landmass, a study was done in now about 4 years ago that showed about 15% of the overall city's economic activity directly or indirectly comes from Times Square. Times Square has always had a really disproportionate economic effect. The Times Square Alliance is really a souped up neighborhood organization, but it happens to be for the theater district in Times Square. Our boundaries cover what was really where the Broadway theaters are. So from 40th Street up to 53rd Street, just west of 6th Avenue to the west side of 8th Avenue plus Restaurant Row. We were started in the early 90s by a combination of the New York Times and the theater owners, because for decades there had been these big plans to make Times Square better. And Times Square, in fact, at that time was one of the most dangerous places, not only in New York City, but in the whole country. There literally is not a major news outlet in the world that hasn't, when they've wanted to talk about what's going on in New York, posted a picture of an empty Times Square, because we're always representing whatever the normal is. And it may be a crazy normal at times, but right now it's this disturbing, sort of surreal, still New York. I think it's a question for New York City overall is how resilient can it be? And I think that just during my lifetime, there's been 3 times when New York City itself was written off. There was the late 70s when Ford to New York dropped dead, the city was bankrupt. Then there was the 80s and the 90s when, because of the crime wave, people just thought that New York City was dying, that people were fleeing to the suburbs. And then after 9/11, people forget that in 2002, when I started in this job, there were really serious questions about whether New York City would survive, whether people would just flee the city. And I think New York is nothing if not resilient. We have been doing an art project with the screens of Times Square to celebrate using artists' work, essential workers. And phase 2 of it is celebrating, in particular, immigrants who are sort of the invisible, unfortunately, people who are often made invisible or forced to be invisible because of many of our country's policies. And so we're doing a collaboration with the New York Immigration Coalition and also this group called For Freedoms that celebrates often unseen and unacknowledged people that are part of the workforce and part of the economy. And I hope that one of the things that grows out of the awfulness of this pandemic is that there's a greater appreciation for the people who are often made to be invisible or are less visible, especially undocumented workers who keep New York City running. We're realistic that we're going to be a little later in the process because Times Square, if nothing else, represents people gathering together, whether it's New Year's Eve or going to a restaurant or going to a show or going to a political rally or demonstration in Times Square. It's fundamentally this place where people gather, and it's this point of intersection. And so people are understandably wary about those exact circumstances. So I think that, again, we may lag a little bit in terms of the pace of coming back. And part of what we have to do is send the signal that we're doing this carefully and thoughtfully as we come back.
That's our look back at 2020. On behalf of all the good folks who make this show happen, I'd like to wish you and your family happy holidays and good health. Join us next time when we'll head over to Jackson Heights in Queens to find out more about what's going on in that part of our diverse city.